Among other things, Foucault is known for his writings on what he would call docile bodies. So what do we mean by that, docile bodies? Well, he was referring to how human beings become a part of a fragmented society. So we will pin ourselves as oppressors against oppressed, right? That's the binary world that we find ourselves in. So it's the victimizers versus the victims. We're obviously boiling out many of the impurities, so to speak, from a lot of his work. But the point is that ever since the 1950s and onward, we start to witness a shift in how we view what we call the human being. We shift from, to borrow a lyric from Incubus's Brandon Boyd, the conception of a human animal, a hybrid of sorts, which knows how to integrate itself within its environment. And we shift from that to, or towards, a different conception of, let's say, the population of persons or human beings as a more fragmented social construct. And Foucault's argument is generally, in my mind, misguiding for a lot of people who read his work, and that's because it allows for those people to feel justified or excused in not having to take accountability for certain actions. So on to Freud. This was a man who struggled with drug addiction, but was also a brilliant thinker. So I guess that shows you even lunatics can influence society in a positive way. We know Freud is probably best known for his study on childhood development, the id, the ego, the superego. These are simple terms for really, in my mind, what's a simple idea. We start life with no concept of the other because we have no ability to discern our own individual selves from those who surround us. In other words, the idea of an individual doesn't exist because we just exist. So mommy is part of me, daddy is part of me. It's all the same. It's not until we age a little bit and start growing and maturing and seeing the world that we start to develop the ability to discern, to categorize, to split or divide, mentally compartmentalize. We begin to understand what it is that emotions are, what relationships are. And we connect with, hopefully other children on the playground or in school and other social environments, and finally become full-fledged adults, whatever the hell that means. And we'll have the capacity to have compassion for others. Now, I know I kind of butchered the explanation of the id to the ego to the superego development, but you get the gist of it, and I'm sure if you haven't studied it, there's plenty of opportunities to. Now, we're going to move on to the question of what is postmodernism and whether it is becoming obsolete.
Bailey, go. Sweet girl. Everyone, it's Bailey. Woo!
Oh, hey there. So we're going to continue now with the postmodernism conversation. We're going to get to why I believe postmodernism is becoming obsolete. But before we do, I want to spend just a few minutes. And when I say a few minutes, you and I both know that really means like 10 minutes, but not quite 10, more like 8 or 9 minutes. Just talking about one particular movie from the early 90s that I think kind of encapsulates what postmodernism is through film. So the movie The Player, starring Tim Robbins, Greta Scucci, and then of course Whoopi Goldberg shows up and has a small role in the film as well. Anyways, I don't want to give the whole plot away, but I'm just going to say that Tim Robbins plays, somewhat of an arrogant film producer who ends up taking a script that ends up actually being about his own life. So we're watching, as the audience, we're kind of watching his life play out through the screenplay that he's taken. So postmodernism in this kind of way is self-referential, meaning it makes the audience engage in a kind of a conversation or dialogue with the actors and the filmmaker, because we're all in on this satirical joke where the filmmaker is making us aware that he or she is aware of him or herself. Even though, of course, we're watching the movie after the fact that the movie was made, right? So it's kind of interesting, it's funny. That's kind of what we mean by postmodernism without getting too specific in the self-referential realm. But let's just discuss for another couple of minutes one other aspect of postmodern film that's gonna then lead us. It'll be a good segue into talking about why I think postmodernism is becoming obsolete. So the other aspect I want to talk about is inevitable egoism and the neglect of personal responsibility. So what this means is, and first I just want to be clear about one thing. I'm not saying postmodernism through the artwork lens. Like, I'm not saying postmodern art is to blame for like having some sort of negative influence on viewers, on consumers. No. I love postmodern art. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is postmodernism as a way of living, as a way of thinking about the world, about oneself and one's role in the world or society at large, etc., whatever. I think it may not be as useful as a way of living as we might believe. And let me give you a good example. So you might be familiar with the French novelist Albert Camus. If you're not, I highly recommend reading some of his works. Most noteworthy of them, to me, of course, is the famous novel The Stranger, which is a famous existential novel. Without giving the plot away or getting too much into it, I'll just briefly describe something to get to a point. So in the novel, our protagonist is a man who commits a crime, but basically takes the majority of the book explaining why he's just not guilty, because after all, the weapon basically just committed the crime by itself. So he's just excused of the crime entirely, right? I mean, after all, how could he be at fault if the weapon was to blame? So therefore, he should be excused from prosecution entirely. That's the argument. So obviously this sounds absurd, but so like, good example, if you watch, excuse me, if you watch like somewhere, I don't know, wherever, somewhere out in the city, you see someone go up to another person and stab them, right? Stab them multiple times and just run off. Then you watch this dude just like start bleeding profusely, right? You wouldn't stand there for 5 minutes contemplating, now, is this guy who just stabbed the other man, is he guilty? Like, is it on him or was it the knife? No, you'd be dialing 911 and calling for an ambulance to help this guy. So it's just an interesting thing because it brings into mind like real life scenarios that you really could apply. So now, with that said, I want to also note existentialism and postmodernism, postmodern thought, have an overlap. So to me, they are akin to two good friends who are on a train. One gets off at a stop in a remote village, and he decides to live the rest of his life in solitude, surrounded by very few people, and nature. The other friend continues to the big city, and he's anticipating the next big scheme that he can cook up, next gig, his next piece of work, if he happens to be some sort of con artist or criminal, then his next crime, and so forth. So this is the kind of world we are addressing with postmodernism versus existentialism. So to me, it's the key difference between those who are going to choose the postmodern route and those who choose the existential route. So I think the former, the postmodernist, will prefer to be in a constant mode of searching, exploring, while the latter, the existentialist, is content to settle in one place for the rest of his or her life because he or she already knows what's true, for them in their small world. These are some things we could apply to movies that we've already discussed in movies we'll talk about further. But The Player, again, with Tim Robbins, is a great movie, highly recommend it. I think you can find it. It's on HBO Max if you have that. Otherwise, I'm not encouraging illegal downloading, but that's going to do it for now. And stay tuned because we're going to continue a conversation on postmodern thought as well as existentialism. And the next segment is going to be about a movie called Molly's Game with Jessica Chastain. So stay tuned for that. And as always, thank you for watching. I'll see you soon.